Great. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about what oceanography is all about and how the oceans kind of began and how the Earth began in that respect. So when we talk about oceanography is simply the study of the oceans and all the animals that are inside those oceans. Okay, another name for oceanography is marine science, and generally it's just the study of the animals in the ocean and the ocean itself. Okay, now when we're investigating oceanography, or scientists that are oceanographers, they do their work and they figure out things about the ocean using the scientific method. And I know you guys have probably heard about the scientific method before, and a lot of times it's easy to get kind of lost in the details of what the scientific method's all about. It's actually super simple, okay? The scientific method, it starts out with some observations, okay? So we'll just start with some observations. All right, so you take some observations of some natural phenomenon that's going on in the oceans. This could be, I don't know, you could be sitting on a dock and you see a bunch of dolphins and they're swimming around, and you might notice, hey, these dolphins, they're making a bunch of sounds underwater. That's simply an observation, and that's kind of the start of the scientific method. The next step of that, method is that once you make an observation, the next step is that you come up with a question related to those observations. You're looking at these dolphins, they're making all these sounds. The next relevant question is, why are they making these sounds? So, have an observation, the next step is a question. Why are these dolphins making these sounds? Okay? In order to kind of address this question, you first have to come up with a guess as to what the answer to that question might be. That guess is called a hypothesis, right? It's a special kind of guess. It's called like an educated guess. All that means is that your guess is based off of the findings of previous work, okay? So in this case, this guess to the question is called a hypothesis. In the case of the dolphins, you might predict that these guys are making all these sounds because they're attempting to find a mate, okay, or whatever it may be. They may be attempting to find a mate, or another hypothesis could be these dolphins are making these sounds in an attempt to hunt and catch food in a cooperative manner, okay? So that's all good, but in order to figure out whether or not your hypothesis is correct, you need to test it. And you test it under the scientific method with an experiment. So, an experiment is really just a test in which you design a series of procedures or experiments that allow you to evaluate the accuracy of your hypothesis. So, I don't know, I've never worked on dolphins before, but a potential experiment to evaluate whether or not these dolphins are making sounds in order to find a mate is, let's take some dolphins and we'll take maybe two groups. In one of the groups, you just plug their ears up with some earplugs so they can't hear, right? The other group, you don't do anything to them. That's your control group. The ones where you plug their ears with the earplugs, that would be your experimental group. And you see whether or not the behavior changes between the two groups. That could give you some clues into whether or not they're using those sounds to communicate, either to find a mate or to find food. Let's say in the group that you plug their ears, those dolphins are now completely unable to catch food as a cooperative group. That would give you evidence that perhaps their ability to communicate with these sounds is essential to catching prey, okay? So these experiments are ultimately going to give you results, okay? And these results are going to be used, like we kind of, alluded to evaluate, kind of accept or reject that hypothesis, that guess that you made. Now, if a hypothesis is consistently supported with observations over and over and over to the point that you almost accept it as a fundamental truth in science. This could be like, well, let me give you an example. Let me step back. So if you have a hypothesis that's consistently supported over and over and over again through tons of experiments, it's supported so often that as scientists, you just view it as kind of fact. Then it becomes a theory. And a lot of people get hung up on this idea of a theory, because a theory in science is a lot different than like your neighbor's theory about, I don't know, why he can't make money or whatever it may be, some random thing. A theory in science is considered to be fact, okay? And it's supported by dozens, hundreds of repeated experiments, okay? And a theory really explains observations. So the theory of natural selection, Darwin's theory of natural selection, this explains why certain individuals are better adapted to their environment and why they live on to pass their genes to the next generation. Scientists view that as fact, and it's pretty solid stuff. Another version of something that a scientist views as fact is a law. All right? Think of a law, it's very similar to a theory. A law is, again, it's an idea that's been supported with experiments for a very long time, dozens of experiments. And think of a law as something that summarizes or explains the natural world, and something that scientists view as fact. Okay? So that's how oceanographers tackle their science. Now, we're going to switch gears here a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about how the Earth was formed, kind of the history of the Earth. So, a long time ago, our universe basically existed as a bunch of atoms of helium and hydrogen. So, if you remember back to chemistry class, which you might have had in college or high school, it doesn't matter. You know, the smallest kind of part of all the things that exist in our universe are called atoms. Okay, two of those atoms are hydrogen and helium. They're not especially large atoms, but basically most of our universe is composed of these two atoms. Well, stars are bundles of hydrogen and helium, bundles of energy that are literally changing these atoms into different, heavier atoms. Okay, so you've got hydrogen and helium. All right. Those are the chemical signals for hydrogen and helium. And what you'll have is that you'll have all this hydrogen and helium floating around. Stars are regions in our universe in which all these hydrogen and helium atoms are actually being converted into heavier atoms like carbon and oxygen. So we'll say that stars are converting these hydrogen and helium atoms, which aren't that heavy, into heavier atoms like carbon and oxygen. They do this through a process called nuclear fusion. It's basically like an atomic bomb, where they're just slamming these atoms together, they're causing these atoms to combine. When that happens, it releases a ton of energy and heat. All that bright sunlight that gets kind of, dumped down on Earth, that's the result of all of these hydrogen and helium atoms being converted into carbon and oxygen through this process called nuclear fusion. Okay? And that basically is what gives off the heat that allows all the processes on Earth to occur. Okay? Old stars will sometimes create even heavier elements like iron. Okay? And so when old stars create really heavy elements like iron, okay, that releases a ton of energy. And these old stars that are kind of exploding this energy as they create really heavy elements, those are called supernovas. Okay. All right, good. Now, our universe just started off as a bunch of this diffuse dust of gases like hydrogen and helium and a bunch of dust that resulted from a bunch of stars that exploded. supernovas that exploded. All this dust started to collide in with each other, and all that fine little dust and gas particles started to produce heavier and heavier little bits of matter. Okay, that process of tiny little things slamming together and producing larger and larger things, that process is called accretion. So that's A-C-C-R-E-T-I-O-N. And this is really how our galaxy and universe started to form. And this happened a really long time ago. But I mean, billions of years ago. But these smaller particles started to turn to large particles. Eventually, stars were formed from this accretion process, okay? And helium and hydrogen started to be converted into heavier elements called carbon and oxygen, okay? And that was really the birth of our sun, okay? Now, if we consider this Earth, okay? Earth is really, it started off as just one of these balls of dust and gas and elements that formed through accretion. Originally, it was just this large ball of mixed up gases and mixed up dust particles, and everything was spread out really evenly, okay? But over time, gravity started to separate out the heavy stuff from the light stuff. So in here, I've drawn like black, purple, blue. There's all these different particles, and they're all mixed up. All right, that was like early Earth. We'll call that, I don't know, young Earth. Well, what happened is that the heavy stuff got pulled to the middle of the Earth through the gravitational pull. Things like iron got pulled down to the middle. As it got pulled down to the middle, it was all this friction as all that iron got moved to the center of the Earth. That generated a lot of heat. So now we'll have the really heavy iron in the center of the Earth. And now it's super hot, just ridiculously hot. And at the same time, all the lighter stuff, like oxygen, aluminum, and silicone, and just lighter kind of atoms, they were pushed to the outside. The outermost layer, right at the surface of the Earth, of these lightest atoms, this now becomes the Earth's crust. All right. Outside of the Earth's crust, we'll have even lighter things, like lighter gases, that are outside of the Earth. That'll be out here. This is now the Earth's atmosphere. This process of the heavy things going in the middle and the light things staying on top, that's called density stratification. When this occurred, when we had our crust that formed, this was really the birth of our Earth. And this occurred about 4.6 billion years ago. So we can say that our Earth formed about 4.6 billion years ago when the crust formed. Okay. Now the atmosphere was very different from what we have now. It was loaded with CO2. It had some nitrogen, but it didn't have a lot of oxygen. A lot of that CO2, and in addition to this, what you would have is a huge amount of clouds that would exist in this atmosphere. You couldn't even see Earth if you were looking at it from a space shuttle. And the Earth was so hot that these clouds were dumping a bunch of rain on the Earth, but it couldn't even stick. It would just immediately evaporate. Over millions and millions of years, the surface of the Earth cooled down just enough so these heavy rains coming down from the atmosphere, the clouds in the atmosphere, started to stick. This was the first stage of our oceans, okay? These heavy rains lasted for like 20 million years. It just rained and rained and rained, and water started to collect in basins along the Earth's crust. That's the earliest oceans. At the same time, you'd have volcanic eruptions that would release more water from the inside of the Earth to the outside. That would add to the depth of the oceans. And you'd have asteroids that were hitting the Earth. So the oceans really formed through three things. Rain, that lasted millions of years. Asteroids hitting, which would add water as well from the asteroids themselves. And volcanic eruptions, which would add water to the oceans. So the oceans formed over a process of a million years through those processes. Okay. Now the atmosphere itself was really high in CO2. A lot of that CO2 dissolved into the ocean itself and became carbonic acid. This occurs through a process where if you take CO2 and you add it to water, what's going to happen is it's going to undergo this reversible chemical reaction in which carbonic acid is formed. Okay, so a lot of the CO2 from the atmosphere went into carbonic acid in the oceans. Okay, so the atmosphere, oceans. So CO2 went down. Around 2 billion years ago, plants evolved. And plants, as we know, they could use CO2 and they use sunlight in order to make oxygen and energy. Okay, so the chemical formula for photosynthesis is you take CO2 and you take water and you combine those two things to make oxygen and sugar. Okay, so then the oxygen levels increased as plants continued to undergo photosynthesis, and this was called the oxygen revolution, and it really produced the atmosphere that we have today. The atmosphere that we have today is about 78% nitrogen, or around 21% oxygen. Not much CO2 at all, around 0.03% CO2, and the rest is made up of trace elements. So this is today's atmosphere. And that's a really short summary of kind of how today's oceans were formed.